Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to join Rutgers Private Equity and Employee Share Ownership Symposium. My name is Jackie Ammon, and I lead our business development efforts around private equity here at Carta. And today we're going to talk about ownership trends in private equity. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, Carta is the connective tissue of the private markets. We basically touch every node there is in the private markets, from companies to sponsors to LPs to financial and legal advisors. And we are uniquely positioned to report on the state of the private markets in every facet as a result of that. And for today's purposes, what do we know? What does Carta know about ownership in private equity? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. We have some data that we're excited to share around that. But, at the outset, we want to make it clear that we really care at Carta about transparency, particularly in this notoriously opaque private market ecosystem. And we leverage data like this to help private equity firms and the portfolio companies that they invest in make better and more informed decisions around equity ownership. And we're super excited to continue that passion and charge today. So with that, I will pass it over to Hamza to share a little bit more about the data we've collected.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. My name is Hamza, and I work for the Insights team at Carta. Our job is to bring transparency to private markets by sharing research and insights using Carta's proprietary data. And today I'd like to go over some of the data-based findings from our recent report on ownership trends in private equity. Given the growing commitments we've seen from notable PE firms to expand broad-based ownership in this industry, we wanted to provide an update on the state of ownership in PE, especially as it pertains to employees. So in this analysis, we aggregated and anonymized data from over 2,700 PE-backed companies that Carta supports through our cap table management software, and came up with some interesting findings to share with you all today. This is actually our second time publishing this annual report, so let's get into it. First, let's take a look at the total number of stakeholders at PE-backed companies. The bars here show the cumulative number of PE-backed stakeholders over time. And on Carta, we have nearly 400,000 stakeholders who have received some type of interest from a PE company as of Q2 of 2024. That figure has effectively doubled over the 4-year period since Q2 2020. And this is due to both Carta's growing market share in this space, as well as increased issuance of interest by PE-backed companies. And the different colored lines in this graph show the percentage increase in the number of stakeholders for each stakeholder type. For example, the blue line represents employees. And since 2019, the number of employee stakeholders on Carta has increased 172%. You can actually see that employees were leading in terms of stakeholder growth until around mid-2022, when management teams in the orange line there kind of overtook employees. Management teams have actually increased 200% in terms of stakeholder count over this time period. As far as employee ownership is concerned, though, you can really see that inflection point in mid-2022, where the blue curve kind of changes shape and starts flattening out a little bit. I want to pair this graph with the next one, which now, instead of cumulative figures, we're looking at the annual count of new stakeholders on Carta for each stakeholder type. And what we see here is that the growth in employee ownership has slowed down substantially over the past 2 years. From 2019 to 2022, the number of new stakeholders who were employees rose annually from around 27,000 all the way up to 43,700. But then in 2022, we saw the market downturn, which led to a decrease in PE deal volume, less activity, and less equity being issued to all types of stakeholders. But the decline really hit employees the hardest, as you can see in the sharp decline in the blue curve. We also saw this in the venture world, of course, where our data showed that there was a decline in equity compensation packages at startups as well. But this isn't necessarily a reversal of the overall trend towards broad-based ownership. A lot of firms are still committed to that, but this is more of an indication of the decline in deal activity and lower market activity overall in the past couple of years. We also did some sector-based analysis in this report. If we look at PE-backed companies on Carta, most of them are in the B2B or healthcare sectors. Those two sectors also have the most PE-backed stakeholders overall. These are pretty wide sector categories. Like B2B includes everything from SaaS to professional services, and healthcare includes everything from health tech to hospital management. Also, the industries with the most stakeholders per company are transportation and logistics, as well as finance and insurance. They each have about 200 stakeholders per company on average. On the other hand, food and agriculture companies tend to have the fewest number of stakeholders per company at around 80 stakeholders on average. Next, in terms of geography, the main thing I want to highlight here is really how widely distributed PE ownership is throughout the United States. So this map shows the number of stakeholders at PE-backed companies on Carta across the US by state. And you can see that 47 out of 50 states are represented here. And most of these states have hundreds, if not thousands, of stakeholders. At the time we pulled this data, the top 5 states, which you can see in the darker red and orange colors on the map, were number 1, California, around 29%, followed by New York at around 14%, Texas and Massachusetts around 9%, and finally Illinois at around 5%. I also wanted to point out that the 6th and 7th largest states in terms of PE ownership are Florida and Utah, which are among some of the fastest growing states in the country economically. So that was interesting to see. These are all these top states are likely also where the most PE eligible companies are based, the types of businesses that PE investors would want to invest in. So that explains a lot of this dynamic, but it is geographically very spread out. And if we compared this distribution, for example, to VC stakeholders, we would see that PE ownership is more geographically spread out than VC ownership is. So this next graph shows the share of stakeholders by type as employee headcount grows. So on the x-axis, we have different tiers of employee headcount, and on the y-axis, we have the share of stakeholders. It makes sense that as companies get larger, you can see that employees represent a larger share of the company's stakeholders. At companies under 10 employees, so really small companies, investors actually make up a majority of the stakeholders at 59%. But by the time a company gets up to over 500 employees, the share of stakeholders who are investors drops down all the way to 8%. We can also look at the percent of PE-backed companies by how many employees they have who have interests. So there are only 29% of PE-backed companies on Carta with no employees who have interests in the company. So that means that over 70% of these companies are providing interest to at least one employee. A majority of these companies had actually at least 10 employees with interests. On the high end, the bottom bar, you can see that around 4% of the companies fall into the category of having at least 500 employees with interests. Now, we know that in the same data set, around 8% of companies overall have at least 500 employees. So that means that at least half of those really large companies aren't issuing interest to the majority of their employees. Otherwise, that 4% would be closer to 8%. So the findings so far have looked at all PE-backed companies on Carta, but we also did some deeper analysis on just PE-backed LLCs and the types of interest that they issue to stakeholders. The most common types are PIUs and CIUs. Profits interest units, or PIUs, of course, represent a share in the company's future profits, which isn't true equity ownership. While on the other hand, capital interest units, or CIUs, do represent true equity ownership. We can see in this graph here that more recipients hold PIUs, which makes sense because those are the ones that are typically issued to employees. And on the other hand, CIUs are issued in larger quantities, as the right column of bars shows. And then there's custom arrangements as well as options and warrants and convertible instruments, but all of those are much less common. We can see that over 60% of the interest holders at PE-backed LLCs are employees, followed by management teams around 22.5%, and then investors around 14.4%. But of course, this doesn't represent the value of the interest that they hold, because management teams and investors will hold a much larger share of the value of any given company that they have a stake in compared to the employees. And part of that is illustrated by the types of interest that they hold. So you can see that on the right-hand side here. For example, investors, around 70% of their interests are CIUs, or capital interests, in the orange bars. That's also the most common type of interest to management teams at around 48%, although they're relatively evenly split with receiving PIUs as well, around 45%. And then PIUs, which are in blue, are most commonly issued to employees, although employees sometimes receive options and custom arrangements, as we discussed. Now, in this chart, we're looking at different stakeholders by the number of unique interests that they hold. So do they just hold PIUs? Do they hold PIUs and CIUs, or something even more of a larger combination than that? The vast majority of stakeholders only hold one type. So if an employee's received PIUs, they'll receive more PIUs. And for example, for investors, 83% of them only hold one type, which is typically CIUs. So if they receive future compensation, it would likely be more of the same type. Management teams are a little bit different, where they're the most likely to hold multiple types of interests. So like a mix of CIUs and PIUs, for example. This graph shows that over 40% of management teams have more than one interest type. And finally, I wanted to share this finding on the relative prevalence of PIUs. So this is an interesting trend that we've noticed, that the share of interests issued by PE-backed LLCs that are PIUs has increased across all stakeholder types since 2019. PIUs now represent a majority of interests issued to both employees and management teams, although they didn't towards the beginning of this timeline. For investors, they're still in like a pretty low minority, but also their relative prevalence of PIUs has gone up a little bit since 2019. And I can think of a few potential explanations for why this might be the case. For example, for employees, this increase in the relative share of PIUs might reflect the fact that more employees at lower levels are being granted interests. And employees at those levels are most certainly going to be granted PIUs as opposed to any other interest type. So that would affect the overall percentage of PIUs amongst the employee group. And given the really increasingly competitive marketplace for talent in the private market space, companies are looking for new ways to retain and incentivize talent, and providing these additional types of compensation on top of salary like PIUs can help with that. In terms of the increase for management teams or investors, it could mean that they're being offered additional forms of compensation on top of the CIUs that they already hold. So we found that many of the management teams and investors that hold PIUs actually already held PIUs. So that ties into the previous slide of them holding multiple interest types. And of course, profit sharing is a really powerful tool for aligning interests. It's already well established for employees, but by granting them to other stakeholder types as well, companies can work to align incentives across all stakeholder types. So this is a trend that we hope to continue tracking through our data as we continue iterating on this report and researching these trends. So that's all I wanted to go over today from this report. And if you want to, you can read the whole report at carta.com/data. On that page, I also encourage you to sign up for our new PE data newsletter, which will be launching shortly, and where we hope to share all kinds of more insights like this. Thank you. And back over to Jackie.
Awesome. Thanks, Hamza. So this data is really helpful. Now you're a private equity sponsor, you're part of a management team at a portfolio company that was just acquired, and you've decided you want to issue equity to employees or to the management team. And everything we just went through explains how to do that and what kind of equity you could give to make sure that you're competitive in the marketplace. Or if you're an employee who might receive equity, like, are you getting a good deal, right? And that's kind of to the point about transparency and efficiency in the private markets. That's what we hope this data can supply. But then, then what? How else is Carta contributing to this ownership economy besides telling you what may or may not be, quote, market? Well, what we're doing is, if you're one of these companies that has 500 employees that you're issuing equity to, that the Excel math might, be buzzing around your head. And so what we're trying to do here, we're not expecting management companies, and nor should management companies or PE firm sponsors spend hours and hours trying to manage all of this in a spreadsheet, in Excel. Carta has created a software solution to provide a single source of truth and simplify the ownership management process for the employees, for the management teams, the sponsors, and their advisors. And so, what does that look like when I say it's, software? I'm talking about literally taking kind of Excel spreadsheet line items and putting them into the cloud, right? A website that you as the management team or the sponsor can go in and make changes, issue equity, add vesting, put in valuation so people understand kind of holistically, what the equity structure looks like. And then for the shareholder, a place to go in and say, okay, I accept this equity that you're giving me. This is how many, units, if it's a unit-based equity structure. This is the vesting that's assigned to it. These are the milestones I have to achieve, or this is the amount of time I have to be at the company, to help you, you collectively management or the PE firm sponsor, or you collectively the employee really understand what this equity means, right? Ultimately, equity is a form of compensation. Hopefully, the equity or the profits interest unit, however you're being compensated, is going to turn into actual dollars one day. And you need, in order to really maximize the return on that, you have to understand what it is and how you get it. And that's what we do here. And so it's meant to be a really simplified version of an Excel spreadsheet that's easy to read, easy to understand. If you're an employee, we tell you how much you vested as of a certain date. And it's just meant to simplify the process so that, I myself am not an Excel wizard, but I don't need to be, right? My equity is somewhere that I can easily read and understand. So if we go to the next slide, just again, kind of putting it all together, right? We are as I said at the top, the connective tissue of the private markets. And so our platform and our software and our offering is meant to be useful, not just for the shareholder or the equity holder or the unit holder, but the admins from the company, management who are going to be maintaining the cap table, the private equity sponsors so they can understand how the liquidation stack works and how the distribution rules will work, consolidating all the equity owned by everyone at the company. And then the advisors, right? The lawyers, the financial advisors, your valuation providers. Carta offers valuations. You may use a third party. Either way, it's a single source of truth for everyone to be able to look at and say, like, okay, this is what our equity structure looks like as of today, and this is how that flows into our financial statements, et cetera. It's really useful, not just for visualizing and understanding, but also just actually issuing the equity, vesting the equity, et cetera. You don't you set it and kind of forget it until you need to update it. And then lastly, we know this is a complex topic. Private equity ownership is complex. Hamza did a really great job explaining all of those charts, but they're complex and they, aggregate a ton of data. So as he mentioned, if you want to learn more about the data, we'd encourage you to go to carta.com/data to see the reports, sign up for the newsletters, see all the great things his team is working on. If you're interested more in learning more about private equity, both from an educational perspective, an ownership perspective, as well as what Carta offers, I'd encourage you to go to carta.com/private-equity to learn more about our cap table solution, our valuations offering, as well as, hundreds of educational resources to learn more about how to issue equity, what kinds of equity you can issue, etc. And with that, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to working with you all in the future.